Morning. Today we are continuing our series on sacred reflections. This is part number 7, and we're going to talk about making marriage work for a lifetime. I'd invite you to follow along for your notes. So if you could just open up your YouVersion Bible app on your phone, you can click More, scroll and select Events, and then click King Street Community Church. And today's notes will be there. It will help you follow along. So our passage to ponder for this series is from Matthew 5, verse 17 through 20. And it says this: "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." So as we've been discussing in the last number of weeks, righteousness is an inside job, right? It begins from within, and then we can show it by the way that we live. And so today, our teaching verse is from Matthew 5, and it's verses 31 through 32. But Jesus here, he's talking a lot about, divorce and adultery, and he's talking about infidelity and marriage and all these different dynamics, which are very, very serious topics for that day and for our day today. But before we jump into it, I just wanted you to help you understand the cultural context that Jesus is speaking to. You have to understand that in first century Israel, the culture's primary cultural value is or was the honor-shame dynamic, right? And honor in this way can be described as a person's feelings of self-worth and the public acknowledgement of that worth. So simply, it's just basically your reputation or your social standing, and it's based on what you think of yourself and what others think of you. So, when we think of honor, it was a little bit different for men and for women. For men, their honor was tied up in the public sphere, and they represented not just themselves, but they represented their families and their tribes and their clans and their entire people group. For women, their honor was more tied up in the domestic sphere. And that was, that depended on how they manage their households. So that's from domestic duties to financial decisions and responsibilities. But both the husband and the wife, both of their honor was dependent upon each other. So people at that time, they weren't like how we are today. We think very much in terms of individualistic terms. How can I make my life better? What can I do to excel and to improve? People at that time, they really thought in a group dynamic. They only thought of themselves as one of many, right? Of their family and of their entire tribe. So if the husband and the wife, their honors both tied in with each other, let's give an example from a marital example that would affect your honor. If a husband was to have a wife who was unfaithful, it wouldn't just bring shame to him. It would really bring shame to his entire family and tribe or clan. And it would kind of bring him down in social standing, which is really the major currency of the day, right? Shame and honor, I should say, is more important than even money at this time. But likewise, if a wife had a husband who divorced her, it kind of put her outside, right, this acceptable social sphere. But even with this being the case, divorce and remarriage were very widely accepted and practiced in first century Israel. It actually got to a point where a man could divorce his wife for any reason, be it significant or superficial. So this is the cultural backdrop of the time. Jesus is speaking to a culture of quick, easy, no-fault divorce. So when he begins his teaching during the Sermon on the Mount, he's often addressing popular sayings or ways of thinking of that day. And last week, as we heard from Pastor Dave, in Matthew 5:27, Jesus, he began with adultery. And he said, "You have heard it was said, you shouldn't commit adultery." But what Jesus does is he raises the bar, and he makes actually adultery and lustful thoughts in our hearts and in our minds tantamount to the physical act, right? And the reason why Jesus says that's so important is really because of what it does to the other person. It devalues them, and in a way, it takes away their honor. So after that teaching, as he's talking about lustfulness, in the same breath, really, in verse 31, he continues along the same way. In verse 31, it says this: "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of who makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So there's a lot in there. There's a lot to unpack right there, and a quick initial reading of it just brings about a lot of questions. So, is Jesus okay with divorce? Is it just in certain circumstances? Is he against remarriage? What would it mean to make your wife a victim of adultery exactly if she were to get remarried? Well, let's unpack that. So, but before we get into Jesus' words in Matthew 5, let's look at some fundamental principles for marriage from God in the Genesis of creation. So in God's original plan, in Genesis 1, chapter 1 and chapter 2, we find the creation account and the beginnings of the first marriage. After the heavens and earth were created and the vegetation and the birds and the sea animals, we come to day 6. And human beings are created in God's image, either male or female. And in chapter 2, we see Eve being created from Adam. And in verse 24, we read, "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." So the first man and the first woman are literally made for each other. Right? And, you can just imagine Adam at the sight of Eve the very first time, just wow, right? Just thinking about how God has just outdone himself this time. And so this whole one flesh idea is the idea of coming together in a sexual union between husband and wife. But it's also a symbol of the bonding of a life together. So there's a sense of oneness that only they can fulfill for each other. This idea of a man leaving his household to be united with his wife is really, he left in the sense that his obligation and his priority was now for his wife, right? And it was actually more so than his parents previously, right? So his wife's well-being becomes the most important human relationship that he has. So the first wedding, as it were, it happens in God's presence, which is very important. So God's vision for marriage is a lifelong covenantal relationship of love, intimacy, and procreation, which literally means the passing on of life between one man and one woman. All right. So once married, the husband and wife, they get to enjoy each other and the people that's been entrusted to them. They're also tasked, though, with managing God's resources that they've been given responsibly and beneficiently. Adam and Eve are told to have dominion over the earth. So it's just this idea of exercising responsible care for the earth. But marriage it's more than a beautiful, intimate relationship between a man and a woman. Paul's words in Ephesians 5 are that in some mysterious way, it represents the relationship of Christ and the church. So this is a picture really of Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. And the inspired words of the Apostle Paul, they give just this additional insight into marriage, even though it is mysterious. So marriage isn't solely about relational or sexual fulfillment or procreation. It's partly about those things, but not entirely. Marriage symbolizes the eternal commitment between God and his people expressed in and through Jesus. So marriage really is about husbands and wives loving, serving, honoring each other above all else in a way that brings God glory. So what that means is that marriage is not actually just about your happiness or your pleasure, right? It's really meant to reflect King Jesus, who for his love for his bride was willing to endure much pain and much hardship. And he came to give his life both metaphorically in the way that he served and give his life literally for the bride. And the bride's responsibility and just willingness is to respond in love and devotion to him, right? That's the picture of marriage that we see from Scripture. But of course, we know that marriages don't always look like this, right? Sin enters the world, and the first marital relationship and all the other ones thereafter, they experience heartache and difficulty. And so let me pause right here and say, if you've ever had to suffer from the immense pain of infidelity, God truly understands what you're going through. In the Old Testament as well, we also get a marriage analogy. And it's this portrait of God as a husband and Israel representing God's people as the wife. And so, but what God experiences is his people continually turning away from him and actually worshiping other gods. And what that God expresses really in the feelings that it is to have an unfaithful spouse. And we see this in Hosea 2, right? God expresses the raw emotions of the hurt that infidelity brings. He expresses anger and even a righteous jealousy. But we also see towards the end of Hosea 2 that God shows the grace and forgiveness of an ever faithful God. He wants to win his bride back, right? He's wounded, he's hurt, but he's willing to do anything to get her back. And it's very interesting because, in that first marriage, God had already known that sin would enter the world. And he already set out a plan for Jesus to win back his people. So when we see our sin this way, we know sin is not just about breaking the rules, right? The Christian life is more than rule keeping, all right? Sin hurts our relationship with God and with others. So when we sin, it's really about us being unfaithful to an ever faithful God, right? So that's why God really does understand what it's like to have an unfaithful spouse. So this brings us back to Jesus' teaching on divorce in our theme verse in Matthew 5. Like you and I, his original hearers during the Sermon on the Mount, they probably had some questions after this teaching on divorce. So many commentators believe that because of the questions, as people were unsure, Jesus he has to address it again. And he does it on a different occasion in Matthew 19. But this time it's the Pharisees who challenge Jesus, and they're trying to kind of discredit him in front of the growing crowds. All right, so we're going to look at Matthew 19. And remember, this is a separate occasion from Matthew 5, but they say similar things, but there's some key differences. So from verse 3. It says, some Pharisees came to him, that's Jesus, to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read, Jesus replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus appeals to Genesis, the creation, and the verse in chapter 2. He says, so they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. The Pharisees asked, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? That's the same certificate of divorce Jesus mentioned in Matthew 5. We're going to talk about that. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay, another verse for us. So, first things first, Jesus upholds marriage as a lifelong commitment. He upholds the sanctity of marriage, how important it is. He appeals to the very beginning at the verse that we looked at in Genesis 2:24. And he says that both man and woman were created for each other, and it was intended to stay that way. So let no one separate what God has joined together. But the Pharisees, they make this appeal to a commandment that was given to Moses from God to the people in Deuteronomy 24. And they mention that certificate of divorce. So let's discuss what that certificate of divorce entailed. In the first century, divorcees, very similarly to widows, they were in a very precarious position. First remember that, divorces were just happening very often. But for divorced women or widowed women, there was like a loss of their social standing. And there was limited opportunity for provision for them, financial provision. So remarriage wasn't always an option. So to remedy this, a certificate of divorce could be issued, allowing the woman to remarry if a new marriage could be arranged for her. It would actually restore her social standing and give her provision, right? So in some ways, the certificate of divorce was a good thing. But like in so many instances of the gospel account, the Pharisees, they knew the teaching of the law, but they missed the meaning of the law. And that's what Jesus came to clarify. So Jesus says Deuteronomy 24 was God's rule for minimizing the effects of sin in the community, right? So he says that divorce is permitted in the case of sexual immorality, but it's not required, right? That's a really important thing. Jesus is saying that the certificate of divorce was a provision, right? It was really a provision for a woman who was wrongly divorced, a woman who was divorced for a trivial reason. Now she could remarry without any moral stigma, and there would be there would be a provision for her. So going back to the sexual immorality part, Jesus is not saying that every instance of sexual immorality should lead to the dissolution of a marriage. He's not saying that, right? We really should give every single effort, the best effort that we can at restoration and forgiveness. We should work towards that. Secondly, Jesus is not saying that divorced people in particular had a hardness of heart. What he's saying is that everyone in the community, sin was in the community, so everyone has a tendency to harden their heart, and that's going to have detrimental effects on a marriage, right? So, and Jesus is also saying that marriage is so sacred that divorce for a trivial reason or remarriage for an ulterior reason is wrong. We're going to get back to the remarriage part, but you'll notice that in Matthew 19, he points to the man who divorces his wife, right? Then he gives the exception clause, but he says the man who divorces his wife with the intention of marrying another. So Jesus is simply saying that if you break down your marriage with the goal of marrying someone else because, of course, the grass is going to be greener, it's going to be so perfect with them, unlike how it is perfect here. Jesus is saying that God says, no, that divorce is illegitimate, right? That is not a good reason, right? And so he's saying that that new marriage actually begins with adultery, right? If we compare this to Matthew 5, Jesus has in the view that a woman who again has been wrongly divorced and she is remarried because she's been issued a certificate of divorce, it's essentially as if she's been forced into committing adultery, right? Because she needed to get remarried again to have her provision in that culture, right? So she's made a victim of adultery in Jesus's words. And so all these things, Jesus really has in mind the fact of the vulnerable party, right? Which in particular at that time was often women, right? But it applies across the board. So now you might think, okay, maybe some of these marriages, these remarriages, they started off with adultery. Isn't that a sin? Isn't that wrong? You could go to the extreme and say, well, should we actually end that marriage to restore the initial one? Well, Jesus doesn't say that, right? And in both instances, Jesus recognizes that the new marriage is a legitimate marriage. So like in all marriages, let no one separate the new husband and wife, right? So if that marriage were to begin with adultery or begin with any type of sexual immorality, they should just acknowledge that before God and the injured parties and ask God for forgiveness, and then focus all their efforts on making the next marriage, their new marriage, work and have it work well. So with all that considered, going back and forth to these scenarios that people were talking about at that time, Jesus' words, they really encourage us to make every reasonable effort at forgiveness and restoration before the dissolution of a marriage. So even if in certain instances, divorce might be permitted, we really should make every effort to make it work. So it's been well documented. The dissolution of a marriage has just so many devastating effects on both spouses, children, the extended family. So we really want to work at it. So we're going to end with this, though. We're going to give you some ways that we can look at how we make your marriage work for a lifetime. So just a couple thoughts as we close. We want to view marriage the way that God sees it, right? God sees marriage as a covenantal, lifelong promise before him. And it represents the good news of Jesus and his kingdom, right? Our marriages are to reflect the way Jesus loved and served his people. And that's what we want to do and respond in kind to each other. Secondly, we want to love each other sacrificially, right? So we want to serve, right? Seek to serve and not be served, right? Just follow Jesus's model. Seek the well-being of your spouse, right? You can love your spouse in very tangible ways. It's a good time to learn your spouse's love language and to really work at loving him or her that way. Thirdly, we want to prioritize each other and encourage each other. So you want to value this marital relationship over all other relationships, right? Value that human relationship over all others. Make it exclusive in thought and in deed. Secondly, you want to build that person up regularly, right? Just speak life into your spouse. Speak life into your relationship, right? Continually be giving them words of encouragement. And fourthly, we really need to practice forgiveness and grace. We want to combat bitterness by practicing forgiveness, right? Forgiveness helps us reconcile. Unforgiveness just tears us apart, and forgiveness makes us whole again. Okay, and of course, we want to practice grace, right? Love covers a multitude of sins, the sins of yourself and the sins of your spouse. So you want to practice grace. And we know that this is a challenging time for marriages, so we are here to help you. If you're going through separation or divorce, don't go through it alone. We have a program called Divorce Care. It's a friendly, judgment-free small group that can help you really navigate your life in a very, very confusing time, right? We have persons there who are just going to love you, and they're going to help guide you in the next steps ahead. We also have the Alpha Marriage Course, and that's a program that's designed to strengthen your marital relationships. And let's make sure we're clear. Every marriage can get stronger, right? So both of these programs, they both begin in February as well as others. So you want to check out our website for more details. Okay, but for now, let me pray for you as we close. Heavenly Father, we know that in this time in particular, Lord, during this COVID-19 pandemic, that it has placed an extremely difficult strain on marriages, Lord. So we do just pray, dear God, that our marital relationships, Lord, that you'll remind us to love our spouse, dear God. Help us to love in a way that is not arrogant or conceited, Lord, but help us to be patient and kind. And help our marriages, Lord, to be just an expression that they're marked by the way that you loved your church, Lord. Help our marriages not to be marked by anger or resentment, dear God, but just by sacrifice and love and commitment. And dear God, for the person who is now suffering through separation or infidelity or divorce, Lord, just be near to them. Be near to the brokenhearted, dear God. Let them feel your comfort. You're the God of all comfort, Lord. So let them feel your peace and bring around them people who will support them, encourage them, and help them through this difficult time. But dear God, we just pray that our marital relationships and all of our relationships, they reflect you, Jesus, the love that you have for us. So help us to give that love to our spouses in particular and extend that love in the right ways to everyone else. So we say all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.